So are other informal transition signals like next or after that. Simone said she had a feeling of pins and needles in her leg. Then it worked its way to her arm. In more formal language, you might find transition signals like at first, subsequently, or after a while. If we wanted to make Simone's story clearer, we could add some transition signals to her story. If we were writing her story, we might use more formal transition signals. Simone had a feeling of pins and needles in her leg. Then it worked its way to her arm. We might say, at first, Simone had a feeling of pins and needles in her leg. After a while, it worked its way to her arm. Notice that transition signals like this are often followed by commas. Adding transition signals has made Simone's story clearer. You can more easily see the order of events. This is very important in formal language. Try to make sure you learn and use a number of different transition signals. Now let's have another listen to a clip of Simone talking about her illness. Pay attention to the type of sentences that Simone uses. Are the sentences simple, compound, or complex?
It worked its way up towards my arm and across. I was just immobile. I couldn't move, I couldn't walk. I was paralysed on this side of my body.
Most of the sentences that Simone uses are simple sentences. If we wanted to write an account of Simone's illness, we could join up some of these sentences to make compound and complex sentences. We form compound and complex sentences by joining simple sentences and phrases together. Simone says, I was just immobile. I couldn't move. I couldn't walk. But we could edit this to say, I was just immobile. I couldn't move or walk. Or, I was just immobile. I could neither move nor walk. Okay, now let's finish with a quick look at the words used in the clip. Listen to the clip one more time and then we'll talk about a quick way to build your vocabulary. Listen again.
I was just immobile. I couldn't move, I couldn't walk. I was paralysed on this side of my body.
Simone says she was immobile. The prefix im is used to make the opposites of words beginning with M or P. Im means not. So immobile is the opposite of mobile. It means not mobile. So we can have mobile and immobile, mature and immature, polite and impolite, patient and impatient. Knowing the opposites of words is very important. Many words just have a different word that means the opposite, like hot, cold, happy, sad, in, out, up, down. But other words take prefixes that mean not, like un, de, dis, in. Listen to some of the clip again, then we'll look at how a few more opposites are formed.
The major signs of having had a stroke that most people would equate with is weakness, so paralysis of an arm, leg or face. In others it can be a loss of speech or an ability to communicate.
He says a sign of a stroke can be an inability to communicate. He uses the in prefix, meaning not. Inability means not having the ability. And here's a few more opposites. She says she was physically fit, emotionally on top of the world. The opposite of fit is unfit. The opposite of emotionally is unemotionally. A great tip is to try to find words with opposite meanings. Some words have several meanings, so they have several opposites as well. A good thesaurus will really help you with this. And that's all from me today. Don't forget to practice forming compound and complex sentences, and remember to practice reading and writing in English every day. I'll see you next time on Study English. Bye. Hello, I'm Margot Politis. Welcome again to Study English IELTS preparation. Today we're going to look at cycles, at phrasal verbs, and then we'll finish with a bit of punctuation. But now here's a man who is a microbiologist and a mushroom grower. He's talking about mushrooms and the part they play in the carbon cycle.
They occur naturally in the forests as wood-degrading fungi. That's their job. When trees die, they grow on the tree. They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
The speaker, Noel Arrold, is talking about how mushrooms grow naturally. They are an important part of the carbon cycle. But what is a cycle? A cycle is a process that is repeated over and over. It goes around and around. But how do we know this from listening to Noel?
When trees die, they grow on the tree. They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
He says, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on. By saying the cycle goes on, he is telling us that this process happens again and again. At the end of the description, you need to signal that the process goes back to the beginning again. We can say the process goes on, the process begins again, the process repeats itself. In a cycle, there is no real end or beginning because the process just keeps going. When describing a cycle, we need to start somewhere, then describe in order each part of the cycle. There are many different ways of describing the stages of a cycle. We can use transition signals like when, once, then, or next. When speaking, you can also use pauses and intonation to describe a cycle. In written language, this becomes punctuation. Listen to Noel Arrold again describing the different parts of the cycle.
When trees die, they grow on the tree.
He says, when trees die, they grow on the tree. When trees die, comma, they grow on the tree. The first part of the cycle is that the trees die. The second part is that when the trees die, fungi grow on the trees. That's the next stage.
When trees die, they grow on the tree. They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms.
Okay, he says that the fungi break down the lignin and the cellulose. They break down the tree. So the third stage is that the fungi break down the tree. Fourth, they produce mushrooms.
When trees die, they grow on the tree. They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil. And so
He says, in turn, organic matter goes back into the soil. In turn signals the next stage of the process. In turn means next or because of that. That's the fifth stage. The organic matter goes back into the soil. And then what happens?
When trees die, they grow on the tree, they break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
The carbon cycle in the forest goes on. The organic matter helps new trees to grow again, and then those trees die. We're back to the first stage again. This is the carbon cycle. Okay, now we're going to look at some phrasal verbs. Phrasal verbs consist of a verb followed by a preposition. This forms a new verb, sometimes related to the original verb, but sometimes not. Phrasal verbs are idiomatic. There's no pattern to the meanings they take, and they often have a number of different meanings. You often can't just guess the meanings of phrasal verbs, you have to learn them. Let's look at the phrasal verbs in this clip.
They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
There were 4 phrasal verbs. They were break down, end up, and 2 using go back, and go on. Notice that sometimes the preposition will give you an indication as to what the phrasal verb might mean. Let's look at these 4. See if you can match the meanings. Break up, end up, go on, go back, and finish, continue, decompose, return. Well, break up means to decompose. Go back means to return. Go on means to continue, and end up means to finish. But notice that break up can sometimes mean finish as well. We can break up from school. In formal writing, we would be more likely to use words like continue or return than phrasal verbs, which tend to be less formal. Phrasal verbs are difficult to learn because there are so many of them. Look at go. We've already seen it with go back and go on, but there's many, many more. And remember, most of these have got more than one meaning. It takes a lot of time to get used to all the phrasal verbs and what they mean. You need to listen carefully to people speaking and the way they use phrasal verbs. Another important thing to do is to write them down in groups and buy a good phrasal verb dictionary. So pay attention to those phrasal verbs. Learning them in groups can be fun, and your spoken English will sound much more natural. Now we're going to look at some writing tips. For variety, it's important that you use a lot of different sentence types of different lengths. The difficult thing is finding the balance. You can join together short sentences using conjunctions, but what do you do with sentences that are too long? This sentence has many ideas, all joined together with and. How many ands are there in the sentence?
They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
There are 4 ands. This sentence is too long and should be edited. The ideas can be broken down into smaller groups and shorter, clearer sentences. There are several ways of doing this. We can use punctuation, conjunctions, and connectors. So let's have a look. Here's the full sentence. We can start by using punctuation. Use a comma to separate clauses. Use full stops to separate complete ideas. And you can replace some of the ands with full stops. But remember, the new sentence must now start with a capital letter. Now we have a clear paragraph expressing a number of ideas with different kinds of sentences. And the carbon cycle goes on. But we can't go on. It's time to end this episode of Study English. But I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Hello, welcome to Study English, Ielts preparation. I'm Margot Politis. We're going to look at articles today, indefinite articles a and an, and the definite article the. But first, let's meet an oceanographer. She's talking about using underwater devices to predict weather patterns. See if you can hear her using articles while she talks about monsoons.
The monsoon gets a lot of its energy from the equatorial and subtropical Indian Oceans. Dr. Susan Widgefalls, an oceanographer from Australia's CSIRO, is hoping that by measuring the state of the Indian Ocean in those areas, scientists will be able to learn something about monsoon predictability.
Predicting the monsoon is a very difficult thing, and yet it impacts on millions and millions of people, and so we think that if we can predict the monsoon usefully, we could make a real difference. We know from El Niño that it's a fully global system, so you can't just study one small part of the ocean and solve these problems. You really need a global integrated observing system, and the Argo program is the first real big ocean attempt to do that, and it's the float technology that's allowed us to even think about doing this.
Using articles before nouns is one of the most difficult things about learning English. You can choose between indefinite articles, a and an, the definite article the, or no article at all. Let's start with the indefinite articles a and an. The rule is that a is used before words starting with a consonant, and an is used before words starting with a vowel. So we have a banana, but an apple. There are a couple of exceptions to the rule. Where the consonant H is not pronounced, we use an. So we say a happy man, but an honest man. The H is not pronounced, so honest sounds like it starts with a vowel. And where the vowel U is pronounced y, we use a. So we say an umbrella, but a user, because user sounds like it begins with a Y. A and an are only used with singular nouns. We use some with plural nouns. The indefinite articles a or an are used to refer to indefinite things, things that aren't specific. You use them when you're referring to any member of a group of things. The indefinite article does not refer to a particular thing, but one out of many possible things. If I say, I would like a banana, I just want any banana, it doesn't matter which one. Let's look at an example of indefinite articles from the clip.
Predicting the monsoon is a very difficult thing, and yet it impacts on millions and millions of people, and so we think that if we can predict the monsoon usefully, we could make a real difference.
She uses the indefinite article twice. She says, predicting the monsoon is a very difficult thing. There are many things that are difficult to do, and predicting the monsoon is just one of them. Secondly, she says we can make a real difference. There are many differences that can be made in the world, but she is just talking about one of them. So when do we use the definite article the or the? Well, we use it when we're referring to definite, specific things. We also use the when we're talking about one particular member of a group. Luckily, there is only one form of the word the, and it can refer to both singular and plural nouns. We say the banana and the bananas. There is a difference in pronunciation though. When the comes before a vowel sound, we say the apples. So the before vowel sounds and the before consonant sounds. Let's look at the clip again. Listen for the.
You really need a global integrated observing system, and the Argo program is the first real big ocean attempt to do that, and it's the float technology that's allowed us to even think about doing this.
She says the Argo program. She uses the because there is only one Argo program. It's a unique particular thing. She also says the float technology. She is talking about that particular type of float technology, not just any